Hi, this is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Iroshizuku Take-sumi. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes, ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a Pilot CM nib. I'll look at writing samples that I did on other types of paper. I'll compare Take-sumi to other black inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. The writing sample that I did using my glass dip nib was nice and pleasant, very uniform and very smooth. The swatch that I made with tweezers was nice and crisp, and the lighter section is not that much lighter than the beginning heavier section. The drip at the end of the swatch isn't very visible until you turn it at an angle and you can see a little halo of sheen. I'm going to begin with a Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. This ink is nice and crisp and very pleasant to write with in this extra fine nib. Next, I'll be writing with my Faber-Castell Ambition. It also has an extra fine stainless steel nib. Now you can see the difference between a European extra fine and a Japanese extra fine is very noticeable, but if the Japanese extra fine is just a little too fine for you, if you don't like the feeling of the feedback just because it's such a smaller point to the nib, this is a very pleasant nib to write with, very smooth. I would call it a buttery smoothness. It's not glassy smooth. You don't feel like you're going to slide off the page, but it's not really a feedback. It's just there's the slightest hint of resistance there. This is a very enjoyable extra fine nib to write with. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Vanishing Point. It has an 18 karat extra fine nib. When I wrote with this pen for the first time, I was blown away by how smooth the nib was for being this fine, and I really like this black ink in a very fine line like this. I like the crispness of it. This is a great pen and ink combination. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Pereira. It has a fine stainless steel nib. A little bit of a hard start there. These nibs have all been dipped in ink, so that might be part of the problem there. Again, this is a very pleasant ink and nib combination. If the extra fine is just a little too fine for you, the boldness of this fine nib is very attractive, I think. Next, I've got a Pilot Grants. It has a 14 karat fine nib. A lot of times these Pilot 14 karat fine nibs, they write drier on the upstroke, and with this nice opaque ink, it's not as noticeable on this one, but you can see the downward stroke is a bit wetter and bolder than the upward stroke, but with this particular ink, it's not quite as dry or not quite as light as with some other inks. And so that's one of the things I like about the Pilot steel nibs. They write with a uniform wetness in all directions, if that makes a difference to you. Next, I've got a Sailor Pro Gear Slim. It also has a 14 karat fine nib. My Pro Gear Slim fine nib also has that slightly drier upstroke, but again, with this really saturated opaque black ink, it's not as noticeable. And Sailor nibs are also known to be more feedbacky, the fine nibs. And on this nice smooth Tomoe River paper, you can feel a little bit of feedback, but mostly you can just hear it. And I didn't note that. I'll just go ahead and write it with this pen. These are both very pleasant. They feel very different on the page, but not unpleasant. Now on other papers, the feedback may be a bit more pronounced. Next, I'll be writing with a Platinum 3776, and it too has a 14 karat fine nib. The Platinum fine nib is similar in wetness to the Sailor and the Pilot 14 karat fine nibs. It writes a bit more uniform in all directions, and it looks bolder like the Pilot fine nib. And I'm surprised by how much I like this black ink with this black platinum pen. It just feels very classy. It has a little bit of feedback. The nib has a little bit of feedback similar to the Sailor Pro Gear Slim, but on this smooth paper, you're mostly just hearing the feedback. The feedback you don't feel quite as much, but just like with the Sailor, on other types of paper, you may feel that feedback a bit more. Next, I'll be writing with a Monteverde Pocket Ripma. It has a mini Omniflex nib. Let me show you down here. I didn't have quite enough room, but on this mini Omniflex, I don't know if it is the same on the full-size Omniflex, but the side strokes are slightly more narrow than the down strokes. So when you're writing kind of small, you see a bit of a slight bit of stubbiness to it. Now, that's not something that a person might notice who's just looking at the writing, but you get just a slight bit of character. This is very nice ink in this pen, and the reverse writing of this nib is also very nice. Noticeably more narrow than the regular writing and very smooth, very good ink flow and very pleasant. Next, I've got a Conklin Minigraph. It has a little stainless steel stub nib. A little bit of a dryness here. I've noticed with this pen, it does tend to dry out a little bit in between writing sessions. I haven't really noticed it as much. I don't think I'm remembering that incorrectly. If I actually have it inked up with a converter, but with these just dip tests, I have had some drying out. Once it starts writing, this nib and ink combination is very fun to write with. I like this little tiny stub nib. There's no tipping, and it's not a crisp stub nib at all. It's very stubby. It's not a, I should say, not a crisp italic. So it's, I think, fairly forgiving. You do have to be careful of the rotation, but not as much as you would with, like I said, a crisp italic that would be cut, straight across rather than rounded. And finally, I'll be writing with my Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel CM nib, which is like a 1.0 stub nib. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed writing with this ink and nib combination. I'm not normally a fan of larger stub nibs, and you may be surprised that I consider this a large stub nib. My nib size of choice is the Pilot Fine Nib, and so this is pretty wide for my taste. But this ink, writing in this nib, is just very velvety feeling and very luxurious. If I were writing on a larger ruling, I think I would enjoy this quite a bit. Okay, while this is drying, let's take a look at some writing samples on other types of paper. On this Rhodia grid paper, I loved everything. This is highly unusual. I don't usually write with this many pens and nibs, but for a black ink, I wanted to see how it would perform in any pen that I would be likely to use a black ink in. And these were all really enjoyable on this Rhodia paper. No bleed through, even in the heavier parts of the swatch and the scribble over here. And they all look great. Even my Platinum Fine Nib, that is known to have some pretty decent feedback, I put the exclamation point there to note that I did feel the feedback, but it still felt nice. My Sailor Pro Gear Slim felt a little dry compared to the others, but it was still nice. And my Faber-Castell Ambition felt velvety like the Pilot Metropolitan, meaning it's just very smooth, but just the slightest hint of resistance, not really even what I would call feedback. I don't really like writing on copy paper with fountain pen ink. It's water-based and it tends to spread out as you write, but some inks and some nibs perform better than others. My Take-sumi here had some pens and nibs that felt nice to write with. The Platinum, though, that is known for its feedback, just felt scratchy. The Conklin Minigraph I noted was just okay, and the Sailor Pro Gear Slim was pretty dry. It wasn't horrible, but it wasn't enjoyable to write with. Same thing with the Grants. This time it was too wet. It wasn't horrible, but just not enjoyable to write with. Out of all these black inks that I've tried so far, the Noodler's Heart of Darkness I felt like was the best on copy paper. It didn't feather as much as the others did. And by feathering, it's not horrible feathering like on the Conklin here. You can see it just looks a little ragged. And some inks can look a little ragged and it looks kind of cool. It looks vintagey, but no, those just didn't look right. You can compare it with the Conklin with the Heart of Darkness, and it's a little bit more crisp. When I first got into fountain pens, I didn't really use any black inks. I think when my dad first gave me some fountain pens to try out, I went to a Staples and bought some black ink cartridges, and they feathered like crazy, and I didn't know any better. But once, I think when I got this Pro Gear Slim, I tried it with one of the included black ink cartridges, and that Sailor Black made me realize, black ink can be enjoyable to write with. Now, Iroshizuku Take-sumi kind of reminds me a lot in its color and how it performs. Kind of reminds me of Aurora Black. Now, Aurora Black in the swatches, I don't know if you'll be able to notice it here. They look pretty similar, but if you look down at the drip at the end of the swatch, Aurora Black does shade a little bit lighter, and you can see it in the swatch that I did with the tweezers. It gets a little bit lighter in the lighter spots than Take-sumi. Private Reserve Infinity Black is also kind of similar in how it performs, though I do like Take-sumi better. Writing with it in a pen, the Take-sumi just feels nicer. The writing experience is nicer. It's got more of a luxurious feel to it. Now, Noodler's X-Feather, up to this point, I would have called it my favorite black ink because it's pretty water resistant. It's not 100% water resistant, but it's pretty water resistant, and it's very black. You can see they're very similar, but it looks like Take-sumi might be a bit blacker. Take-sumi isn't quite as water resistant, but it just feels nicer in the nib. One of the things I notice about X-Feather is even though it's really black, it feels really watery. And so I noticed writing with it in my Pilot Fine nibs, it feels more like writing with a roller ball. Like when I was in high school, I used to write with, I think they were called the Pilot Precise, and I enjoyed that, but there's a difference between the feeling of a roller ball and the feeling of a fountain pen. And certain fountain pen inks feel more luxurious, feel more viscous maybe, not as watery. Now, the most water-resistant black ink I've ever used is Noodler's Black. The downside is it's not as black as the other black inks that I've used. You can see it shades really light. It's almost like a sepia black or a black sepia. Yeah, I would call it a sepia black. It's very water resistant. Once you write with it, it's not going anywhere. It's just, depending on the pen you write in, how wet it is, it might not be very black. Now, Noodler's Heart of Darkness is kind of a happy medium between Noodler's Black, which isn't quite as black, and Noodler's X-Feather, which is really black, but not as water resistant as Noodler's Black. And so for a very brief time, Noodler's Heart of Darkness was my favorite black ink. But Take-sumi is just so much fun to write with. The feeling of it, I should say. And Diamine Onyx Black is a nice black ink, but I was shocked at how not water resistant it is. And I have one other black ink in my collection. In fact, I mentioned it earlier, Sailor Gentle Black. When I wrote with that black ink cartridge in my Pro Gear Slim, I loved it. I loved the experience. So I got a bottle of Sailor Gentle Black, and the water resistance of it is similar. That Sailor Gentle Black is similar to the water resistance of the Pilot Iroshizuku and the Aurora Black. All three of these are very similar. And I was kind of kicking myself when I started writing with Take-sumi. I thought, I wish I had a bottle of it instead of Gentle Black, but the writing experience I think is pretty similar. Sailor Gentle Black has that luxurious feel, and I don't know if you'll be able to see it here. Sailor Gentle Black is more of a true black. And here's my water resistance test that I did just of Take-sumi. One concern I have with this level of water resistance, I'm happy with the legibility of it, but if I had an entire journal of this that got wet, maybe there was a flood or a fire and there was water damage to a journal, if I had several pages of it, would all the black just kind of run and bleed together? Would it still be legible? That I'm not sure. Maybe that's something I could test, but to be honest, none of the stuff that I have written, I don't have any documents written with my black ink that I really need to archive. Nothing that would be devastating if I lost it. All right, now that this is dry, it looks like I'm seeing some sheen. I don't know if y'all will be able to see it yeah, see how the Conklin mini graph, it looks like it's still wet. No, there's a lot of sheen on there. That's surprising. On my smiley faces over here, when I turn it just the right way, they look like they're still wet. This is the kind of sheen that I don't hate the look of it. I just don't like it because you can't tell by looking at it whether your ink is dry or not. But it's dry. That's interesting. That's kind of a surprise. On the other writing samples, you know, Rhodia, you don't see as much sheen. Sheen doesn't show up as much, so I wasn't expecting sheen in the writing. Interesting. Let's see. No bleed through even on the heavy bits. There's quite a bit of show through on this Tomoe River paper just because this is such a dark ink. Normally, I'm a fan of Pilot Fine nibs, but I have to say my favorite out of all of these was that Platinum. I don't use black ink a lot. It seems like if I'm writing with black ink, it's for something serious, something important. And in this black and gold Platinum, it just looks like it's meant to write with a black ink. Interesting. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.